If you ever thought about starting your own podcast, you should check out Riverside. Riverside is an online recording studio that lets you record podcasts and video in studio quality from anywhere. And if you click on the affiliated link in the episode description and you buy a subscription, you will also be supporting the podcast. And if you are going to start your own podcast, or you just want to continue to listen to great podcasts, you're going to need headphones or speakers. If you click on the Amazon affiliated link, you can get great deals on headphones and speakers. And if you make a purchase, it will also help support the podcast. And if you ever want to read a book I have mentioned on this podcast, I now have an affiliated link for Bookshop. All the affiliated links that I mentioned will be in the episode description for this episode. I just wanted to remind you that this podcast has merch, and this podcast is also on Patreon, and there's some perks that come along with joining the Patreon. I will leave the links to both of those things in the show notes. For centuries, there was a certain way that the First Lady of the United States had to act. Certain duties that she just could not get out of. The First Lady was not a role that was made to rock the boat. It was not a role for the outspoken, for the free thinker, for the rule breaker. Well, not until the woman I'm about to tell you about came along. Hi, my name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 19th episode of the 4th season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. We are in season 4 of History Shelf, and it is titled They Are a Rainbow. This season of History Shelf, I will be covering each week a historical figure that was part of the LGBTQIA community. These were people that during their time they had to hide a part of their identity from the world. So while I fully believe that those that were out and proud in their lifetime, even if it had the potential to cost them everything, deserved to be praised and recognized, those are not the people that I will be covering this season. I am covering the ones that were made to love in the shadows, the ones that had to lie to most or all of the people around them. Now, I know that sexual orientation and gender identity are complex, and some of the terms that I will use to describe these subjects were not around in some of their lifetimes. So some of these subjects obviously would not have used the same words to describe themselves as I will be using. But I don't want to get too hung up on my wording. I just want to celebrate a part of these individuals that in their time there was pressure all around them to feel shame about. I want to focus on that love and gender are not black and white. They are a rainbow. And for this week, I'm talking about Eleanor Roosevelt. Hello, we've made it to the 11th person of the season. Eleanor Roosevelt is someone that I've wanted to cover on this podcast since I started it, basically. I have been fascinated by Eleanor Roosevelt's life since I was like a preteen. So I'm very excited about this episode. When I read Red, White, and Royal Blue, and that was the book/movie that inspired this season. If you listened to the first Alexander Hamilton episode, you know that already. She's mentioned in that book, so I was really excited that I finally found a season that I could talk about Eleanor Roosevelt. I also wanted to tell you that I have a new mic. I don't know if the sound sounds better or not. I think it does. My old mic went kaput, so I had to get a new one, and I got this mic, and I like it. I think it's better sound quality. Let me know what you think about the new mic. You can drop a comment down below if you're listening on Spotify, or you can reach out to me on social media. All right, now let's talk about Eleanor Roosevelt. Anna Eleanor Roosevelt was born on October 11th, 1884 in New York City, New York, in the United States. Eleanor went by her middle name, so that is what I will call her. Her mother was Anna Hall, and her father was Elliott Roosevelt. Elliott was the younger brother of the 26th President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. So, on Eleanor's father's side, she was the niece of a U.S. president, and on her mother's side, she was the niece of two tennis champions, Valentine Gill Hall III and Edward Ludlow Hall. Eleanor's nickname as a child was Granny because she was more serious than a child her age normally was. Maybe that was because Eleanor did not have a happy childhood. Sure, she came from a well-to-do family. She had loads of wealth and privilege, but that didn't mean that her childhood didn't come with its own set of hardships. Eleanor did not have the best relationship with her mother. Her mother was not there for her emotionally. She was ashamed of Eleanor's, quote, plainness. Eleanor was the oldest of her siblings, and she was the only girl. Her parents had a son after Eleanor named Elliott Jr. Then Eleanor's father had an affair with one of their servants. She was a woman named Katie Mann. That affair produced a son named Elliott Roosevelt Mann. And then Eleanor's parents had another son named Gracie Hall Roosevelt. He went by his middle name, Hall. Eleanor had a traumatic event happen to her when she was 2 years old. On May 19, 1887, Eleanor was on board the SS Britannic with her parents and her Aunt Tissy. The ship collided with White Star liner SS Celtic. Eleanor was put on a lifeboat and she was safely returned to New York, but the event left Eleanor with a fear of ships and the sea for the rest of her life. Eleanor's father was an alcoholic. Elliott never really was stable. His family hoped that marrying would calm him down, but it didn't. In 1889, he also got addicted to morphine and laudanum after he broke one of his legs. In 1892, Eleanor's father was sent to a mental asylum in France. While he was there, he wrote to Eleanor often. After he got out of the asylum, he and Eleanor's mother separated. On December 7th, 1892, Eleanor's mother died from diphtheria. In May of 1893, diphtheria also took Eleanor's brother, Elliott Jr. The fact of losing his wife and son so close together was too much for Eleanor's father to handle. By this time, his drinking had really gotten out of hand. He was drinking several bottles of champagne and brandy every day. He struggled to deal with Anna and Elliott's death, and on August 13th, 1894, Elliott Sr. tried to take his own life by jumping out of a window. He survived the fall, but the next day he suffered a seizure. He died of heart failure that evening. Eleanor was now an orphan. Eleanor struggled with depression after the loss of her parents and brother, and she would struggle with depression for the rest of her life. That is something that we have encountered a few times this season. We found out how the death of Emily Dickinson's parents, especially her father, affected her, and then Virginia Woolf's depression started when she lost her mother. After the death of her mother, Eleanor went to live with her mother's mother, Mary Livingston Ludlow. Before Eleanor's father died, he told her to act as her brother Hall's mother. It was something that Eleanor took to heart. She doted on him. She was a chaperone for him when he was attending school. Every time Hall accomplished something, she was proud like a mother would be. Eleanor struggled with insecurities. She didn't receive much affection, and she saw herself as an ugly duckling. I'm sure her mother probably had a hand in giving her that mindset. Though she tried to not get too hung up on her looks, she wrote this at the age of just 14. Quote, "No matter how plain a woman may be, if truth and loyalty are stamped upon her face, all will be attracted to her." End quote. Eleanor was first tutored privately, and then in 1899 she was sent to a private school in London, England. This school was called Allen's Wood Academy. She was 15 when she started going there, and she stayed there until 1902. She loved it there, and everyone there loved her. She grew close with the head mistress, Marie Sylvester. They maintained a correspondence until Marie died in March of 1905. There in London, Eleanor's confidence grew. Eleanor wanted to stay at Allen's Wood Academy, but her grandmother made her come home in 1902 so she could make her social debut. So she came back to the United States. On December 14th, 1902, she was presented at a debutante ball. Later, a coming out party was thrown for her. Now, when I say a coming out party, I do not mean that she told her family that she was LGBTQ and they were like, "Yay, I'm so happy for you for coming out. Let's celebrate and have a party." Eleanor was LGBTQ, obviously, or I wouldn't be talking about her this season, but what I mean by a coming out party here is that Eleanor was out in society. Eleanor had a horrible time at the party. This is what she said about the party. Quote, "It was simply awful. It was a beautiful party, of course, but I was so unhappy because a girl who comes out is so utterly miserable if she does not know all the young people. Of course, I had been so long abroad that I had lost touch with all the girls I used to know in New York. I was miserable through all that." End quote. There in New York, Eleanor became involved in social service work. She joined the Junior League, that was a non-profit educational women's volunteer organization. She also taught at the Rivington Street Settlement House. Eleanor was very religious. She was an Episcopalian for all of her life. In the summer of 1902, Eleanor got on a train, and on that train was her father's fifth cousin. So it would have been her fifth cousin once removed. This cousin was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The two began secretly corresponding with each other and seeing each other romantically. They were engaged on November 22nd, 1903. But they had a problem. Franklin's mother, Sarah Ann Delano, did not approve. Sarah sent Franklin away on a Caribbean cruise, hoping that some distance would make Franklin change his mind about marrying Eleanor. It did not. The couple were married on St. Patrick's Day in 1905, so on March 17, 1905, in New York City. Eleanor's uncle, Theodore Roosevelt, was the one that gave Eleanor away. Theodore was present during the time of their wedding. Theodore was asked by newspapers what he thought about his niece marrying her cousin. His response was, quote, "It is a good thing to keep the name in the family." End quote. Eleanor and Franklin took a preliminary honeymoon at Hyde Park in New York, and then they went on their formal honeymoon in the summer after they were married. They had a 3-month honeymoon touring Europe. which shows you just how much wealth and privilege that they came from, that they were able to take a 3-month vacation gallivanting around Europe. They returned to the United States and they settled in New York City. They moved into a house that was given to them by Franklin's mother. It overlooked the Hudson River in Hyde Park. Eleanor and her mother-in-law were not besties, which is no real shocker, seeing as Sarah didn't even want Franklin to marry Eleanor in the first place. The townhouse that Sarah gave them was connected to her home by sliding doors. Sarah treated both homes like they were hers. Eleanor tried to address this with Franklin. She said, quote, "I did not like to live in a house which was not represent the way I wanted to live," end quote. But there was very little that changed. It got worse when Eleanor and Franklin had children. Sarah was very controlling over Eleanor and Franklin's kids. Eleanor said this about Sarah overstepping when it came to her children, quote, "Franklin's children were more my mother-in-law's children than they were mine," end quote. Eleanor's oldest son, James, even said that Sarah said, quote, "Your mother only bore you. I am more your mother than your mother is," end quote. Eleanor and Franklin had 6 children together. Anna Eleanor was born on May 3rd, 1906. James II was born on December 23rd, 1907. He was called James II because Franklin's father was James, and James II was named after his grandfather. Franklin Jr. was born in March of 1909. Elliot was born on September 23rd, 1910. Then there was another Franklin Jr. that was born on August 17th, 1914. And then John Aspinwall was born on March 13th, 1916. All of Eleanor and Franklin's children survived adulthood except one. The first Franklin Jr. got the flu. The flu caused heart damage, and Franklin died in November of 1909. Even though Eleanor had 6 children, she had an aversion to sex, or at least an aversion to sex with her husband. She told her daughter Anna that it was an ordeal to be born. Eleanor also wasn't very motherly. Eleanor wrote this about herself, quote, "It did not come naturally to me to understand little children or to enjoy them," end quote. In September of 1918, Eleanor and Franklin's marriage changed. Eleanor was unpacking Franklin's suitcase one September day, and she came across some letters. They were love letters. They were love letters to Franklin from Eleanor's social secretary, Lucy Mercer. Eleanor found out through these letters that Franklin had been having an affair with Lucy, and he was thinking about leaving Eleanor for her. Eleanor offered Franklin a divorce after discovering the letters, but this was 1918. It was not as common to get a divorce back then as it is today. Divorce brought scandal. Franklin's political advisor, Lewis Howe, advised against him getting a divorce. Franklin's mother told him that she would disinherit Franklin if he divorced Eleanor. She didn't like Eleanor, but she liked scandal even less. So Eleanor and Franklin remained married. Franklin vowed to stop seeing Lucy. But, like I said, their marriage did change. It was now more like a business arrangement, a political partnership. Eleanor pretty much abandoned her role as wife and focused more on her public life. And her and Franklin lived in separate homes. Her social work came first now. America joined World War I on April 4th, 1914. During the war, Eleanor was active with the American Red Cross, and she also volunteered in Navy hospitals. When the 1920 presidential election came around, James M. Cox, an American politician, was the Democratic presidential candidate. James picked Franklin as his vice president pick. James and Franklin did not win. They lost to Warren G. Harding. In August of 1921, the Roosevelts were vacationing in Canada when Franklin was diagnosed with polio. Eleanor nursed Franklin during this time. She was probably the reason why Franklin survived. Franklin survived, but his legs were paralyzed. Franklin's mother wanted him to retire from politics and move to the country. Eleanor encouraged Franklin to stay in politics. Franklin listened to Eleanor. Eleanor was now no longer under Sarah's thumb. Eleanor's public role became bigger. She participated in the League of Women Voters. She joined the Women's Trade Union League and worked for the women's division of the New York State Democratic Committee. Eleanor established a nonprofit furniture factory in Hyde Park, New York, called Valkill Industries. She also taught at the Todd Hunter School. That was a girls' private school in New York City. In 1927, she became a co-owner of that school. Eleanor expressed some anti-Semitism. In 1918, Eleanor talked to her mother-in-law about her disgust for rich Jews. She told her, quote, "Jew party was appalling. I never wished to hear money, jewels, or stables mentioned again," end quote. Now, I know that I have said this before, but I feel like it is something that is good to repeat. Just because I cover someone on this podcast doesn't mean that I agree with all or any of their views and beliefs. And it also doesn't mean that I agree with all or any of their actions. When Eleanor became co-owner of Todd Hunter School, there was a limited number of Jews that were admitted to the school. Eleanor said that the spirit of the school, quote, "would be different if we had too large a proportion of Jewish children," end quote. She said that Jews were not American enough. Her anti-Semitism would decline later in life. She would become good friends with a Jewish man named Bernard Baruch. He was a close advisor to Franklin during World War II. She also became a supporter of Israel. In 1924, the Democratic governor of New York, Alfred E. Smith, was running for re-election. His Republican opponent was Eleanor's first cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, Jr. Eleanor campaigned for Alfred. Franklin spoke out about the Teapot Dome scandal. This was a bribery scandal. The Secretary of the Interior, Albert Bacon Fall, leased Navy petroleum reserves at the Teapot Dome in Wyoming to private oil companies at low rates without competitive bidding. It was said at the time that Eleanor's cousin, Theodore Jr., was involved in this scandal, but it was later revealed that he was not. On the campaign trail, Eleanor traveled in a car that had a papier-mâché bonnet that was shaped like a giant teapot. She also called her cousin immature. Alfred won against Theodore Jr. This caused some bad blood in the family. Definitely made some tense moments at the family reunion. One of Eleanor's aunts, Anna Roosevelt's cows, publicly broke with Eleanor. This is what Anna said, quote, "I just hate to have Eleanor let herself look as she does. Though never handsome, she always had to me a charming effect, but alas, and lack a day, since politics have become her choicest interest, all her charm has disappeared," end quote. Eleanor was dismissive of Anna's criticism. She just called Anna an aged woman. Eventually, Eleanor and Anna repaired their relationship, but Theodore Jr. never forgave his cousin. Eleanor said that she did regret the way that she handled the campaign. She said that it was the Democratic Party's idea to do the tactics that she did. She called them dirty tricksters. In 1920, Alfred E. Smith ran for president, but he didn't win. But Franklin ran for the governor of New York, and he won. Eleanor did a lot of work when Franklin became governor. The fact that he was paralyzed was not kept hidden from the public. That is actually a myth. There were newspapers writing about it. Newspapers like the New York Times and Time magazine were writing about Franklin's condition. But Eleanor did do a lot of work. She gave speeches around the state and she inspected state facilities. Franklin became the 32nd President of the United States on March 4th, 1933. While the Roosevelts were on the campaign trail, the Associated Press assigned the reporter Lorraine Hickok to write about them. On the trail, Eleanor and Lorena fell in love. The two women wrote letters to each other. I'm not going to be sharing with you all of their letters because they wrote each other 3,000 letters. There's no way that I could read all of those to you. Eleanor wrote Lorena daily 10 to 15 page letters. Eleanor called Lorena Hick. At some points in the relationship, the two were writing each other twice a day. Some have claimed that, the two were just really good friends. But Lorena left the Associated Press because she believed that her journalistic integrity had been compromised. Lorena then moved into the White House and she started working as a staff member. Not only did Eleanor call Lorena Hick, but she also called her dear or dearest. Lorena gave Eleanor a sapphire ring. Eleanor wore that ring to Franklin's 1933 inauguration. Eleanor wrote this to Lorena, quote, "I ache to hold you close. Your ring is of great comfort. I look at it and think she does love me, or I wouldn't be wearing it," end quote. Lorena wrote to Eleanor in one letter, quote, "I want to put my arms around you and kiss you at the corner of your mouth," end quote. She also wrote this, quote, "I can't kiss you, so I kiss your picture good night and good morning," end quote. We don't know if the women took their relationship past writing love letters to each other, and if they did, we don't know just how far they took their physical relationship. Well, Lorena was not completely out because, well, this was the 1930s. You couldn't be a lesbian and be out and have it be largely accepted by society in 1930s America. But it was known by White House journalists and correspondents, and maybe by J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director. He may have known about Eleanor and Lorena's relationship. That is what the movie J. Edgar suggests. He did have a large file on Eleanor, and he hated basically everything about her. The fiery romance between Eleanor and Lorena eventually burned out, and the only thing that remained in the ashes was friendship. But it would be a close friendship that Eleanor would have for the rest of her life. There were other people that Eleanor may have been romantically involved with. Eleanor worked very closely with New Deal Administrator Harry Hopkins. Their suspected romance was the talk of Washington, but that could have just been a rumor. We do know for sure that Eleanor and Harry had a close friendship. They both worked together to defend the New Deal relief programs. The New Deal was a domestic program of Franklin's administration that brought immediate economic relief and reformed industry, architecture, finance, water power, labor, and housing. Another maybe flame was New York State Police Sergeant Earl Miller. Earl was Eleanor's bodyguard. At this time, Eleanor was 44 and Earl was 32. They became good friends. He taught her different sports like diving and riding and tennis. They would regularly sit with their hands on each other's knees. Biographer Blanche Wiesen Cook says that Earl was Eleanor's first romantic involvement in her middle age years. Biographer Hazel Rowley writes, quote, "There is no doubt that Eleanor was in love with Earl for a time, but they are most unlikely to have had an affair." End quote. Eleanor's son, James, thinks that Eleanor's relationship with Earl was her first real romance outside of her marriage. He stated that Earl, quote, "encouraged her to take pride in herself, to be unafraid of facing the world. He did a lot for her. She seemed to draw strength from him when he was by her side, and she came to rely on him. He became a part of the family too, and gave her a great deal of what her husband and we, her sons, failed to give her. Above all, he made her feel that she was a woman." End quote. I like that quote. I like that Eleanor had a son that saw her not only as his mother, but also as a human. It is sometimes difficult to come to terms with the fact that your parents are also humans, and from this quote, it seems that James handled that well. And I have seen a picture of Earl, and if Eleanor did have a sexual relationship with Earl, I get it. I ain't mad at her if she wanted to be the Whitney Houston to his Kevin Costner. Now, if you are feeling sorry for Franklin, let me remind you of his affair with Lucy Mercer. And he was also having an affair with his secretary, Marguerite LaHand, around this time. And Eleanor and Franklin were okay with the arrangement and the relationship that they had. Franklin also may have had an affair with Crown Princess Martha of Norway, or at least that is according to Franklin's son, James. Eleanor also was friends with Amelia Earhart. There is no proof or even any speculation that they were anything more than friends, but I just thought that that fact was neat. And that's where I'm going to end this episode. Next week, I will pick up with telling you what Eleanor Roosevelt did as First Lady. Thank you so much for listening to the 19th episode of the second season of History Shelf. I'm covering 15 people this season. Next week's episode is going to be Eleanor Roosevelt Part 2. I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is at History Shelf. The Instagram is at history_shelf_pod. The Twitter/X is at History Shelf Pod. And the Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store, or you can become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will send out a shout out to you on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. I will also select one Patreon at random for each episode I do, and at the end of that episode, I will give that Patreon a shout out. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month. And with that, you get the first tier, plus you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month. And with that, you get the first two tiers, plus you will get a handwritten note of thanks mail to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month. And with that, you get the first three tiers, plus you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. You can choose any item that you want except for the zip-up hoodie. You can also take out ad space on this podcast. I have a gig on Fiverr that lets you do that. I also have some affiliated links. There's one for Riverside, one for Amazon, and one for Bookshop. If you click on one of those links and you buy something, that helps support the podcast. But if you don't want any of the merch, and you don't want any of the perks, and you don't want to buy anything, but you still want to help support the podcast, I have turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. The links to everything that I just mentioned will be in the show notes. But as always, the best way that you can help support this podcast is to continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways that you can help out this podcast for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would be very helpful. All right, well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode. Bye.